Good evening, everyone. We're going to give people just a few more seconds to join, and then we'll get started. So thank you so much for your patience. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the next in our series of virtual events. Today's event is titled Pathways to Freedom Through Texas and into Mexico, Freedom Seekers and Assistance Across a Fluid Border. As you all know, we have been offering these virtual events for the last 14 months, and through them, we have been able to stay in touch with old friends and have made many, many new ones as well. And as always, our hope is that through these events, you will continue to know us, the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission, a little bit more, and learn more about our mission and our work to support the Texas Historical Commission in its preservation efforts across the state. Many of you have chosen to support us through these events, and for that, we are very, very grateful. We hope that you will continue to join us and enjoy the content that we share. I wanted to also welcome some of our Texas Historical Commission commissioners and friends of the THC board members and advisors who have joined us today. Thank you all for being here. We also have some colleagues from the Texas Historical Commission who have joined us. I wanted to also introduce my colleagues, our team at the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission. Katie Kukerbaum, who is the brains behind these events. She's the one who organizes them and schedules them and brings in our speakers. Thank you, Katie, for all of that. Yega Ramazani, who's the behind the scenes person at the Friends, who keeps us all doing what we do every day. And Hope Baran from El Paso, who is our social media coordinator, who has been reaching out to you via Facebook at THC Friends, and on Instagram and Twitter at friends_THC. If you are on social media, we really request you to join us, follow us on these platforms. We are also broadcasting live today on Facebook, and we will send out the link to this Facebook Live event to all of the registered attendees after the event. So you can share it, you can watch it again, and pass it forward as well. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that we have our next virtual event also scheduled. This event is titled Exploring the Undertold Stories of Texas. It is scheduled for May 12th at 6 p.m. This event is going to be presented by Bob Brinkman, who is the coordinator of THC's Historical Marker Program, and Sarah McCluskey, who is a historian in the THC's Historical Marker Program. During this presentation, Bob and Sarah will share some of the stories of some of the more than the 200 or so undertold markers that the THC has approved and installed across the state, in addition to about 16,000 Texas historical markers that you see across the state as you travel on our state and interstate highways. Registration for this event is open already, so please do go ahead and sign up, and we look forward to having you join us for that as well. A few housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker today. We would appreciate it if you could keep your microphones on mute during the presentation, your cameras on as much as possible. As soon as our presenter starts presenting, I would recommend that you switch to speaker mode or speaker view on your Zoom. And you can do that by hovering your mouse on the top right corner of your screen. You'll see a button that says View. If you click on that and then click side-by-side speaker, and that will take you into speaker mode, which will allow you to watch the presentation and see the speaker as well. We will start with the presentation and we will have a Q&A at the end. But if you are so inclined, please throw in your question or comment in the chat box. Katie and I will be keeping track of that, and we will either throw the question over to our speaker during the presentation, or we'll hold it till the end and then share it, and then you can have a conversation. And again, as I mentioned, we are broadcasting on Facebook Live. That's FYI for all of you. It is now my privilege to introduce our speaker for tonight. As many of you know, our motto, the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission's motto, is preserving the real places and real stories of Texas. So storytelling is key to what we do, and it's key to the work of historic preservation, as you all know. And our presenter today is an educator who enjoys sharing stories from Texas history with her students, and is here to do the same with all of us tonight. Roseann Bacha-Garza is a lecturer of anthropology and serves as the program manager of the Community Historical Archaeology Project with Schools, otherwise known as the CHAPS program, at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley in Edinburgh, Texas. She was a 2020 nominee for the University of Texas Regents Outstanding Teaching Award and the UTRGV Faculty Excellence Award in Community Engaged Scholarship. Roseann is co-author of Blue and Gray on the Border, the Rio Grande Valley Civil War Trail, and she is co-editor of the Civil War on the Rio Grande, 1846 to 1876. She has also co-edited the books The Native American Peoples of South Texas and From Porciones to Colonias, The Power of Place and Community-Based Learning in K through 12 Education, as part of a grant-funded project for Rio Grande Valley K through 12 educators. She was a 2021 nominee for Texan of the Year by the Dallas Morning News for her research regarding freedom seekers and pathways to freedom through Texas and into Mexico. Roseann is dedicated to cultural heritage preservation and community engaged scholarship along the US-Mexico borderlands, where her research interests lie in African American families in antebellum South Texas, Civil War era history, and Native American peoples of South Texas. Again, please make sure you're viewing in speaker view so that you can see the presentation well. And Roseann, thank you so much for taking time to be with us this evening and for sharing your stories, your expertise, your knowledge. And with that, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Anjali, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to Katie Kirkerbaum of the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission for inviting me here today to speak with all of you. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to giving my presentation. So, whoops, there we go. Okay, so my name, like Anjali said, I'm Roseann Bacha-Garza. I'm a lecturer of anthropology at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley in Edinburgh, down here on the border with Mexico. As you can see, I put the little red star on the map, so you can see exactly where I am. We've got a lot of people tuning in from all over Texas. So welcome, and thanks for being here today. So I am speaking to you from the US-Mexico or Texas-Mexico borderland region. I am one of the founding members of the CHAPS program here at UTRGV, and CHAPS is an acronym for the Community Historical Archaeology Project with Schools program. And we have developed several programs since our inception in 2009, but it's our Rio Grande Valley Civil War Trail project that brings me here today. And so with that thought in mind, what brings me here to speak with you today is my specialized research into regional history regarding pre-Civil War migration of mixed race families that have settled along the Rio Grande and are known to have participated in Underground Railroad-like activity on the banks of the Rio Grande here in Hidalgo County, Texas. This research has not only gained attention at the regional and state levels, but at the national and international levels as well. And this research has not only sparked interest in self-emancipators and their quest for freedom across the international border into Mexico, but it is also speaking directly to the racial identity in the Texas-Mexico borderlands as well. So CHAPS is a program that is dedicated to preserving regional history and cultural resources with the end goal in mind to promote cultural heritage tourism and ultimately create the 1,200-mile expanse of the Rio Grande as a national heritage corridor. We were recently awarded the Governor's Award for Historic Preservation by the Texas Historical Commission. And we have also been instrumental in developing a public heritage initiative at our university, and we'll be launching that new major in the fall called Public Heritage and Community Engagement. And so since this award was awarded to us in February of 21 at the Real Places Conference last year, virtually, we were not in person to thank everybody who was involved, but I would like to thank again everybody at the Texas Historical Commission who made this award possible for us. So please accept our sincerest thanks. So here in the slide, you can see a map picturing the known routes along which freedom seekers traveled to escape enslavement. You can see that most of the map shows routes that go northward through the northern United States and into Canada. You can see also that there are some arrows moving southward through Texas and over the border into Mexico. And so these are the studied pathways of freedom that freedom seekers took in order to self-emancipate themselves. And what we learn about typically in our US history books is the pathway to freedom or the pathways to freedom through those northern states and into Canada. We hear about conductors like Harriet Tubman and others who, especially through Philadelphia, who were able to record travelers going north. But we don't have that type of system traveling south through Texas and into Mexico. And this is something that's sparking some big interest in several scholars who are embarking on this wonderful research. And so I just wanted you to see here the different pathways that many of you have probably already seen in your studies in school. So here on these maps that shows the borderland region. Again, I put the big red star down at the bottom because that's where I am physically, and that's where. So here on these maps that shows the borderland. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. I got a lot of reverberation there. So this is, I have the red star in the map to show us, to show everybody where we are in the region of Texas that I'm going to be focusing on tonight. And so highlighted in this map are the cotton trails that existed in South Texas that led to the Rio Grande Valley. These routes were traversed by ox carts and wagon trains stacked with bales of cotton, shepherded by slaves from plantations in East Texas, bringing cotton to market, particularly to the international ports of Brownsville and Matamoros. And during this period in the 1840s and 1850s, and well into the Civil War era in the 1860s, for example, plantation owners brought their product down to the border so that they could sell their cotton to buyers from all over the world that were waiting on ships in the Gulf of Mexico at the mouth of the Rio Grande. And so again, just notice the focus of my study here is represented near the red star on the map that shows Edinburgh, which is now called Hidalgo, and then and Reynosa, and those sister cities there. And Edinburgh, back in the mid 1800s, is not to be confused with the Edinburgh, Texas, where I'm sitting right now at the university, which is about 16 miles north of the Rio Grande. So what type of terrain did these freedom seekers have to tackle on their way to the Mexican border? They had to tackle or traverse the Nueces Strip. And even today, for those of you in the audience who've driven Highway 281 south between San Antonio and McAllen, you know this region is one that is seemingly uninhabitable because of its dry and sandy terrain. And there are a few, if any, flowing rivers and streams. The vegetation or growth across large parts of the Nueces Strip is made up of unnavigable chaparral, or otherwise known as thick, thorny mesquite brush, with the abundance of critters like rattlesnakes and tarantulas and scorpions. And the region is often very hot throughout most of the year, with very little shade from the sun. So it was a desolate region back in the mid 1800s, and that was known for attacks by Native Americans during that time. And even today, it's still a sparsely populated region of Texas. So when we talk about the push-pull issues and how they affected freedom seekers trying to emancipate themselves, we think about a few things. What was pushing them out of the southern United States, and what was pulling them toward freedom in Mexico. And so in particular, I often talk about the Fugitive Slave Act that was reenacted in and it was an act that was that talked about or called for people to capture runaway slaves, or what they refer to as fugitive slaves that had escaped from captivity, and then to capture them and to bring them back to their owners and re-enslave them. That was there were some already emancipated slaves that were worrying about their safety as well. And for those of you who have seen the film 12 Years a Slave, you'll understand what we mean by the fear that was struck into these people, because even some of those who were already emancipated and had freedom papers were actually duped and tricked into being recaptured and then sold back into slavery by some unscrupulous people. And then I also talk about the Dred Scott decision, when in 1857, Dred Scott had sued his owner, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and a decision was made when he argued that his owner, when his owner took him from Missouri across state lines to a free state of Minnesota, that he should automatically become free. And the federal government's position was that they had no right to tell the South where they could or could not take their property. And so this, again, was striking a lot of fear into folks who were hopeful to gain their freedom and get over state lines into free states. And it was pushing them out of where they were. And then what was pulling them south through Texas and into Mexico was the fact that slavery had been abolished in Mexico, and that Mexico was not participating in any type of extradition of slaves who found themselves standing on Mexican soil, and they were not going to be sending them back to Texas or into the United States. So you have Mexico and their stance on slavery and not wanting to continue with that practice. Also, what was happening during that period of time as well, Mexico was looking to help populate their northern regions, and so they were offering either free or very inexpensive land to African American families, whether they were already emancipated or not. They were advertising that, come to Mexico and you can have some land and settle in the northern regions, because Mexico, quite frankly, was tired of having a lot of movement into their territory and having land being taken away. And so that was something that was happening because Mexico was tired of encroachment throughout their northern territory. So here is where I begin the part of the presentation that focuses on the mixed race families that relocated to the Rio Grande Valley of Texas in the early to mid 1850s. And these two families consisted of a white man, his African-American spouse, who was an emancipated slave, and their mixed race children. And the Webbers came to the Rio Grande Valley from Webbers Prairie, which is a suburb south and east of Austin, a place today known to some of you as Webberville. And then the Jacksons came from Wilcox County, Alabama. And so here in these images, I have what is left of these ranch properties that were settled by these two families. So the Webbers arrived here on the newly established international border around 1851. Keeping in mind that in 1848, the Mexican-American War finished and resulted in the Rio Grande becoming the natural and international border between the two countries. And then the Jacksons came a few years later in 1857. So John Ferdinand Webber was a veteran of the War of 1812 and had moved to Austin's colony in 1824. He became involved with his neighbor's slave. Her name was Sylvia Hector. And they had their first child, Elsie, in 1829. And by 1834, Webber was able to procure Sylvia's freedom and the freedom of their first three children together. And remember, at that time, a child born to a slave, even if the father was white, was considered property of the slave owner and thus considered a slave. And so that's, whoops, sorry. And one of my colleagues, Maria Esther Hammock, has done a tremendous job doing some research on Sylvia Hector and had found her slave emancipation papers in Austin at the Briscoe Center. And she does a lot of talking and speaking about that as well.
Roseann, I wanted to let you know that Dr. Hammock is on this call today.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. She's somebody else you should have speak with your group. She's a terrific researcher and is doing wonderful work. So here I have on this map, I kind of wanted to give you a picture of where Weberville is. It was called Weber's Prairie when John Weber bought his, or was who got his grant of land in Austin's colony. And his business, the way he kept himself and his family fed, was trading, going on long trips across the Nueces Strip that I had described to you, but he stayed a little bit further toward the north, a little bit shorter distance, crossing the Rio Grande, which while he was in Austin's colony was still part of Mexico, and traveling across the river and selling his wares in a place called San Fernando, something we know, a place we know today as Zaragoza. And so I've indicated that with the red arrows on the map. And so he traversed this Nueces Strip often and was very familiar with the terrain and the territory, and, was, took chances and had to make, ward off Native American attacks and the like. So he was used to this type of travel and had a lot of experience with it. But when it came time to relocating his family, he decided not to take the route that he was taking and much more familiar with. He decided to come down toward the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, toward the town of Reynosa, and where they eventually settled in Hidalgo County. I have two other inset maps in here. The one up on the upper right, it circles Weber's Prairie. That was on the map of the 1840s and 50s. It is, you can see that it is in between Austin and Bastrop. And so Weberville that is where Weberville is today. And then the opposite, or the map on the bottom shows the El Camino Real, and that was the beaten path of the day. At that time, it was also the beaten path of slave catchers, and so that was a place that Weber knew, and Weber knew well, and was not interested in traveling along that with his family to avoid people who were searching for African-American peoples to capture and put back into slavery. So he chose a different route toward a different region of Texas. So technically there's about 30 miles difference between those pathways, but he chose the longer and, in his opinion, safer route to bring his family toward freedom, or to keep his family as free people, because he had already purchased the freedom of his wife, Sylvia Hector, which they did marry in Weber's Prairie, and then the freedom of their first three children, but they continued to have children after that. They ended up having a total of 11 children. So here's an image of Sylvia Hector that appears in Dr. Hammock's Texas State Historical Association's biography of Sylvia Hector. And so here it's a sketch drawn by somebody who had actually seen Sylvia Hector. You can see underneath the plate that she's carrying as one of her children is kind of hiding behind her apron. And so, but the Weber family had been pushed out of Weber's Prairie, and with the increase in hostility sparked by that Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, Also in Weber's Prairie, they were reasonably accepted throughout the time, like the 2 decades of 1830s, 1840s by neighbors. But as more population came into the region of Southern planters and the like, who had no patience or desire to be around a couple and a family of this origin, they were feeling that they needed to leave. And so they headed toward Mexico. And but they stopped short of Mexico on the newly established international border and purchased land in the Agostero del Gato land grant, which I have here shown on the map. And eventually, a little bit later, they bought more land in the La Blanca land grant. So I just want you to see where on the border these properties are. And so this is where they settled, and this is where I believe their last child was born, and they had a total of 11 children. So instead of crossing the border and settling in Mexico, this is where they stayed on the northern banks of the Rio Grande, purchasing 8,856 acres of land in Hidalgo County, Texas, and that encompasses towns we know today as Alamo and Donna. So also, let's see. So here we have the Jackson family, and we have Nathaniel Jackson is the patriarch of this family, and he was a white Alabama plantation owner. And his wife, we would call her common law wife, because they didn't actually get married because of the anti-miscegenation laws in Alabama where they came from. And her name was Matilda Hicks. So the research that I've done on this family shows that Nathaniel Jackson and Matilda Hicks were both born in Georgia in either 1799 or 1800, both around, the turn of the 19th century, both born in Georgia. And Nathaniel Jackson's father had a plantation in Georgia. And it's my theory that Matilda Hicks's family they were slaves on Nathaniel's father's plantation, and being born around the same time, they would have grown up together on that plantation and been friendly within with the other children until Matilda would have been old enough to go out into the fields and function as a slave. Later on, Nathaniel went to Alabama and had a plantation of his own. And Matilda shows up, not by name, but Matilda and their children show up on the census records, let's say, for example, in 1850 in Wilcox County, Alabama. And because Matilda was Black, as were the first 3 daughters she had with another man, and then their 7 children that they had together, and were Black and presented as Black, they were not marked on the census by their name, but just by a checkbox in a mark that would have said female slave, age 20 to 30. And there would have been a check mark. And all of those check marks on the 1850 census for the Jackson family in Wilcox County, Alabama, coincide with Matilda, her first 3 daughters, and then their 7 children together, along with Matilda's brother and sister-in-law as well. So this is this is what we see when we do the research on them. And the Jackson family were feeling pushed out of Alabama because, like I had mentioned, that Dred Scott decision of 1857, also in the state of Louisiana, the neighboring state of Louisiana, they were making it illegal to emancipate any slaves after around about that time, as were other surrounding southern states were making it a law that you could not emancipate any slaves anymore. Nathaniel Jackson had a brother who was part of Austin's 300. And so Nathaniel Jackson was familiar with the idea to travel west into Texas. And, but I think he was also privy to certain newspaper articles that were coming about in, let's say, Louisiana. Mobile, Alabama was also a port that traveled down to Port Isabel as well. And listening and hearing to people talking about Mexico giving free land away, or Mexico enticing freedom seekers and or already emancipated slaves to settle in colonies in the northern reaches of Mexico, I think they decided to head for the border. So upon arrival in Hidalgo County, Nathaniel Jackson bought 5,535 acres of land, and they settled on their property that already had a licensed ferry landing. The Webbers, for example, secured their license for their ferry landing in 1857, the same year that the Jacksons arrived as well. So we had these two like-minded families living nearby each other. And then they were also, therefore intermingling with other Tejano ranchers of the region and immediately assimilating into Tejano culture, so much so that they were calling themselves by Spanish names. So Jeremiah Morrill Weber is now known as Marcelino Weber, or Jeremiah Marcelino Weber. And John Ferdinand Weber took on the name Juan Fernando Weber. Sarah Jane Weber, it was Juanita Weber. There was an immediate assimilation into Tejano culture, immediate assimilation and acceptance into Tejano culture. And so as they are mingling with each other and marrying into and across these family lines, they're creating an additional mixed race group of families within this borderland population. And so what I have here in these pictures are some of the descendants of Nathaniel Jackson, Matilda Hicks. This Nathaniel Polo Jackson was a jailer in the Hidalgo County jailing system. And he was Nathaniel Jackson's grandson. And the other image I have here are Jeremiah Marcelino Weber's daughter, Timotea Weber, at her wedding. These are all Weber grandchildren, John and Sylvia in this picture. It's really hard to get images of John Ferdinand Weber, Sylvia Hector, Nathaniel Jackson, and Matilda Hicks. But what we do have available to us are, their pictures of their descendants. And so the image I have in the center here comes from the Brownsville Herald in 1942. And the reason I have it up here is because I want you all to see that the Jackson Ranch, for example, was known at that time to be a settlement that came up of what they referred to as runaway slaves. Although I think that they were just seeking a place to live in peace and harmony with their family, away from the American South that, because they were Black, automatically recognized them as slaves or servants. And so, but these families had assimilated so well into the culture and had made their mark on society, so much so that a few decades later, Eli Jackson, one of the sons of Matilda and Nathaniel, was a governor appointed official, and then later an elected official in the region as a Hidalgo County commissioner. So these are some images that that we have of their descendants. Whoops, sorry. So one of the things researchers are trying to find are actual, emancipation papers of the Jacksons, of Matilda Hicks and the children that she had. And then also talking about the recognition of Matilda as the wife of Nathaniel Jackson. And so what I have here is an example of a research done in the early 1900s to somebody was trying to throw shade, or what they call in lawyerly terms, cloud certain judgments of whether or not Nathaniel had a perfect right to the land that he bought, and whether after his death did Matilda have the right to inherit that property. And so research was done, and it was stated and is recognized by the state of Texas based on other cases that the relationship between Nathaniel Jackson and Matilda Hicks was constituted as man and wife through common law, if you will. So what makes, So what makes these families so notable, and what makes them different, and what makes them unique is their long-standing loyal relationships. We all too many times, as we watch a lot of these films that come out about slavery and the ugliness we see portrayed in some of those films, where you have a white man, a plantation owner, or maybe one of the men who are in charge of making sure that the slaves get their work done. They take advantage of a Black woman, and they rape her, and then it produces a child, and that white man typically ignores that child and either does it again to the same woman or to a different one, and the cycle is just ugly, and it produces children who have no father that recognizes them. And then oftentimes, we see that those children are sold to other owners, and then, never to be seen by the mother again. But what makes these families notable is that they have these long-standing loyal relationships with each other, and then with their families, and they stay together as a family unit. They travel together, they settle together, and they remain a very strong family. Both of the Weber families, the Webers and the Jacksons, and even today, I have the pleasure of meeting many of the descendants and speaking with them and continuing further research with them. And, this is a very, these are very strong family units. And so, we had reports by historians that came before me, several decades before me, who felt that this subject was extremely important and needed to be talked about and written about. So back in the 60s, one of my predecessors from decades and decades ago wrote about the Webers and the Jacksons. And here you can see she, through her research, finds that Weber was willing to stand by his principles and chose to settle in another area rather than, reject what he thought was the right thing to do. So they came to the border. They came to an area where discrimination was not as prevalent as it was in other places in Texas. And then they're also, both Nathaniel Jackson and John Weber are leaving property to their heirs, being their wives and their children. So if these two white men did not care for the Black women that they slept with and had children with, why would they be leaving them their property and their possessions? And so, this is what makes these families notable. And the fact that they were very strong-minded, and I'm looking forward to Dr. Hammock's publication of her doctoral dissertation, because she's done a tremendous amount of research on Sylvia Hector and other members of the Weber family. And stay tuned for that. But Maria refers to Sylvia as a freedom fighter and somebody who makes a strong stance in the community and stands by her principles and morals. And so, these are stories that need to be told. And I'm very honored and happy to be one of the people who is researching this. So how is this research evolving? One of the things I've been getting involved with here, or I started doing with a colleague in our geology department here at UTRGV, is I'm trying to actually locate the licensed ferry landings that I talk about in my research, because I believe that these are conduits to freedom. And this is, both of the Weber and Jackson families had licensed ferry landings on their property. And they have, through their family stories and oral histories that have been passed down through generations, we know that this type of traffic passed through both of these ranches. And so because our river, the Rio Grande, is very, it moves because it's on, an alluvial delta, the actual ferry landings don't exist anymore, but I'm trying to locate where they are. So last summer, with the help of one of a Weber family descendant, Sophia Bravo, we were interviewed down by the river and appeared in a Discovery Plus or Discovery Science Channel series called Underground Railroad: The Secret History. And so what we did was, this is the only map, the map that's on the screen right now comes from the Texas General Land Office. And I've been looking through lots of maps, and it's the only map I had seen that actually showed the ferry landings at the Jackson Ranch and at the Weber Ranch. And so when Jackson came down and bought property, here's where the ranch was, but he bought property that encompassed the Capote Ranch. And that's what the family talks about, being from the El Capote Ranch. And that ferry landing had already existed by the time Jackson came and bought all of this property. And then the Webers had their ferry landing here. And so I'm trying to work with my colleague, Sarah Hardage, who is a GIS mapping specialist, so that she can help me find and locate where exactly these ferry landings were back in 1857. So what she has done is taken the 1892 map, which is the only one we have available to us that indicates where the ferries were, and she's overlaid them with the current Google Earth map. And so she's laid it out so we can kind of have an idea of where the ferry landings might be. And so based on her research and her skills here, we have this is where the Weber Cemetery is today, the picture I showed you several slides ago. And then this dot here, the triangle, coincides with this triangle here, which is where the person who did the map stated that the Weber Cemetery, the Weber Ranch was in 1892. And then down here, the green dot is where the ferry is. So as you can see in this map, the Weber ferry, if we were to find it today, would be in Mexico. So I may have a little bit more difficulty accomplishing that, but I'm going to still work on it. And so, and then, keep in mind also, when I showed you the map a few slides ago of the Agostero del Gato land grant map and the La Blanca map, it's a pretty wide piece of property. And if John and Sylvia started out over here, and as their children got married and had ranches within this property on their own, I can tell you that one of the family units of Elsie Weber and John Jackson, these two families even married each other, their properties were over in this area, closer to where we think the ferry was. So as, and keeping in mind, there was 11 children that, was spreading out, making their own families, making their own way. So we had a lot of property to deal with. And then I also put this map up here to show a international water and boundary map from 1912 that shows this is the Weber Ranch, which is over here where the cemetery is. And then this is where the ferry was. And I'm thinking that it is along this banco that was a broken off piece of the Rio Grande, because you would have a ferry landing across the river from where people live, right? You're not going to put a ferry landing where nobody's going to take it. These public licensed ferry landings were also a way in which these ranchers were able to earn some money. So, and then the Jackson Ranch, I show you here. This is where the Jackson Ranch was located. This is where the ferry was located. And then this is where the Jackson Church property and cemeteries are today. So they also had bought 5,535 acres, and their family members were spreading out amongst that acreage as well. Something unique and interesting that I found very interesting after giving a presentation just like this about a year or two ago at the Baptist Church in Brenham. One of their viewers sent me some information that I had not known before. And so I find it fascinating and interesting that 20 years after the Webers left, after they were pushed out of Weber's Prairie, the folks in Weber's Prairie continued with the Weber name, calling it Weberville. But then 20 years later, it becomes a freedom colony. So I just find that very ironic. I would like to look more into this history. For those of you in the audience who teach, maybe you would like to challenge some of your students to look into this as well. So that freedom colony was called Hogeye, and it was in Travis County and Weberville. So just to wrap up here, I think I have another slide or two. I do want to just say that, I've been very happy to be part of this research. The young man in this picture here is Lupe Flores, and he is a descendant of Elsie Weber and John Jackson. And he was born and raised down by on the part of the Weber property, and was a student of ours here at UTRGV. Is now getting his PhD at Rice University. So we're very proud of him. And so he and I were first interviewed in 2017 by a curious journalist. And since that time, this is what sparked more interest year after year after year in this research. You know, both Dr. Hammock and I and a few others were interviewed by John Burnett out of NPR in Austin back in 2021. I've been interviewed by BBC The World, BBC Mundo, Channel 22 in Mexico City, New York City Public Radio, Houston Public Radio or NPR, and you know, it's just been blossoming. I've given presentations in Philadelphia and Los Angeles, and I was supposed to give one in Minnesota this summer. So it's just been, the attention has been fascinating and wonderful. And I'm so glad that this is happening. And then Lupe, one of the things that Lupe was researching when he was with us, still at UTRGV, he was researching traffic, you know, smuggling traffic of liquor and other things during his research here, and talking about refugees also fleeing over the border. And in our day and age, we have refugees fleeing this way, coming north over the border. But, you know, 160 plus years ago, that population fleeing over the border was going in the opposite direction. And they were people who were trying to self-emancipate themselves. So I also want to let you know, I have a film on, it is available on YouTube. Dr. Hammock was in the film with us. We invited her back in 2018 while she was still a student at UT in Austin, getting her PhD, to be part of this film because of her wonderful research, as we do have other scholars in here as well. It's an award-winning film called Just a Ferry Ride to Freedom. You can see it on YouTube. It is available on YouTube. And so you might want to, if you have a chance, take a look at it. And so I think I just want to finish by talking just briefly about participating as an agent of change in this time of, in this age of diversity and equity and inclusion. These are buzzwords that we hear a lot, not only in education, but in the news and the media and all across all kinds of disciplines. You know, what I hope to accomplish with this research, you know, starting small and hopefully building on it, is that people start to become more aware of who they are and start to embrace the differences that people see across racial lines, for example. You know, the historian who wrote about the Webbers and the Jacksons back in the 60s and the 70s was so perplexed as to why some of the family members decades ago were not even recognizing who Sylvia Hector was and what she did and what she accomplished to get their family to safety and to stay together as a family unit and to function as a freedom fighter. And, you know, during certain periods of our US history, you know, during the civil rights movement and so forth and so on, you know, that kind of ugliness was prevalent, you know, looking down upon African-American people and their descendants and not wanting to say, hey, you know, I have African-American roots. And so, you know, she was perplexed by this and really felt that it needed to be told. But now I see when I give these presentations across the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, and I meet with these family members, they are really proud of this. And they're celebrating it, they're embracing it. So this is an important thing to note. And I hope that this trend continues and that more and more family members become aware of this, and not just within the Webbers and the Jacksons and their extended families. I want to see it more across the board, so that we can all start being more kind and accepting, kind to each other, and more accepting of others. And so I'm just going to finish here by showing all of the, and this does not include all of the members of the Webbers and the Jacksons that I have spoken to through the years. These are people who have actually contributed to my research, and others research as well, who I've interacted with and I've done work with. You know, again, I would like to thank Dr. Maria Hammock for her work, her participation in our film, our continued collaboration. We've given presentations together. We are going to give a presentation or a roundtable discussion in San Antonio in October at the Western Historical Association's conference. And so I'm really looking forward to that as well. And, you know, I've listed many people here, and I just would like to say thank you to all of them. And thank you for your time and attention today. So with that, I'll open it up to some questions.
Rosanna.
Do you want me to?
If you could, yeah, if you could go out of your share screen so we can see everybody, and
Okay. Let's go. Oh, stop share. Okay.
there we go. Thank you so much for this incredibly fascinating presentation. We do have a few questions in the chat box, but I did hear someone, I think somebody was trying to ask a question, so I'm gonna let them jump in first, and then I'll go back to all the questions in the chat box.
Thank you. This is Dina, and in the chat box, there's a question about the Indian tribe or tribes that occupied that area. And I think the question from Deborah is about what happened to their land, meaning the Indian tribes' land in that area, because you were describing how Weber was going back and forth from Weberville on down south to Mexico and encountering these tribes. So what ended up happening with their land, please? The Indian tribe land.
Well, I'm not an expert at that in particular. I do know that the Comanches and the Lipan-Apache in particular down here, I think Weber would have crossed paths with Lipan-Apache and Comanches crossing the Nueces Strip, to, closer to what we know today as Piedras Negras and Eagle Pass. And so there's definitely a history of that up in that region. Down here in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, we have also a history of Lipan-Apache, and then other smaller tribes, Coahuiltecan bands, for example, the Carrizo Come Crudo tribe. There was also other ones in the region called the Casas Chiquitas, the Tampacuas, Los Narices, Los Garzas. So there were smaller Native American tribes from Coahuiltecan bands here, along with Lipan-Apache. I don't know what happened to their lands physically, as other than, as it's kind of a different presentation to roll into, but 100 years before what I'm talking about today with you all was the Spanish colonial settlements that came up from the interior of what we know today as Mexico, and they settled along the banks of the Rio Grande in what they call Las Vías del Norte, and they had, part of their responsibility to the King of Spain was to protect these lands from Native American incursions. I know that Native American peoples were captured and put into work within these villas, these little villages. And then, of course, also were absorbed into these Spanish colonial settlements. So I hope that answered your question.
And I think Deborah clarified her question. Deborah, I'm going to ask you to unmute and ask your question, because that was my question as well. What happened to the thousands of acres that the Jackson and Weber families owned? What do they still own some of that land? What is the situation?
What happened with them, and what has happened also with many Spanish colonial settlers 100 years before them, is that their lands were, like, upon the death of Nathaniel Jackson, for example, their Matilda Hicks and then the children were the rightful heirs to these properties. And as time went along, they arrived in 1857. The children established themselves in their own, what I would say, mini ranches, and had their own particular pieces of this property that were deeded to them after Nathaniel's death. And let's say for the Jacksons in particular, I would say by the 1880s, a lot of the property was sold off, and depending on who you talk to and how and the research and the direction of certain pieces of research, there is evidence that some of the land was sold, and then there was evidence that some of the lands, and this is not just the Jacksons and the Webers, but others down here, were, let's say, condemned by the law at the time, the sheriff. And I know, for example, in 1880, Sheriff John Klossner bought the majority of the Jackson Ranch properties. And then he started his San Juan plantation beyond 1880, 1890 into the 1900s. And so the Webers as well had all of that land, but as John Weber died, and Sylvia Hector and their children, well, some of them, not all of the children, were granted some of this land as an inheritance. They either sold it or lost it, either failure to pay taxes and things like that. So, did I answer that?
Thank you. Yes. I am looking through the chat. So Tim Dalby asks, the Carrizo Come Crudo tribe occupied the Rio Grande Valley. Ever any mention of them? Or was that before the time that you were talking about?
Well, the Carrizo Come Crudo tribe had made their presence known recently with the Eli Jackson Cemetery property, which, both historic Jackson properties right now, the Jackson Ranch Church and Graveyard, and then the Eli Jackson Cemetery, which is located about 500 feet to the east along the same road. Both fall south of the border wall. So as the border wall was being built and the Jacksons were fighting to stop the border wall from being built north of these properties, because people are still being buried in these cemeteries, people are still visiting their ancestors there, and other church activities are happening at the Jackson Ranch Methodist Church. The Carrizo Come Crudo tribe came in and camped there in order to protest the border wall and to make known their their presence in the area and the history of their presence in the area. So I personally haven't looked into the dispossession of land by or to as a resultant to these Native American groups. But there are representatives from that tribe who have.
Are there any land holdings along the border right now that are significantly large, that are historically part of this movement south of families like the Webbers or the Jacksons? Are there any significant, or have most of them kind of been over the generations kind of split up and sort of not lost, but kind of diluted?
Yes, the latter. You know, what makes this research unique is that there is still evidence. I mean, thank goodness there is still evidence of these two places, the Weber family cemetery, which now I believe I read today that the Weber family has created a nonprofit group. They're pushing forward in terms of preservation, and they've also received an undertold marker for that cemetery. And I believe and Maria can probably shed more light on this than I can. I believe it's called the John and Sylvia Weber Cemetery. I think that's how they put their undertold marker in there, and that is perfect because, you know, it's historically, you know, as it is, sometimes the women get put off to the side, you know, so we need to recognize the women as well, especially Sylvia Hector and Matilda Hicks, because of their bravery and because of what they've lived through and whatnot. So thank goodness that we still have places to physically visit of these two historic families.
Tim Dalby also mentions in the chat, he's talking about 3 natural gas plants among 12 12 national refuges and historic sites that are coming up. And he's talking about properties along Highway 41, which is where Garcia pasture is located, and how some of these properties will be impacted by these plants. So it's sort of an ongoing, I guess his point is there's an ongoing threat to these historic sites and properties at the border.
There's a lot of very special and unique, smaller and less known places from Boca Chica Beach, the opening of the Rio Grande, all the way up the river. That's why I did a project with the National Park Service last summer on their Network to Freedom program. And I myself and 4 other scholars who are studying this subject worked together for 3 days and shared our experiences, our knowledge. And we had a public session at the end of it to talk about what we've learned from each other. And the purpose of that was to place specific sites, in particular in Texas, on their Network to Freedom Trail. And so in the end, I suggested that the whole entire expanse of the 1,200-mile expanse of the Rio Grande, that's the Texas-Mexico border, be considered a national heritage corridor because of all of these spots along the river that are popping up in people's research, not just my own, but in several people's research. And so, so that we can preserve these places forever.
Thank you. Dina is asking if you can recommend a book or 2 or resources that can best tell this history.
Well, I first and foremost, I would recommend Maria's book whenever it comes out. So Dr. Hammock, the pressure is on, because it's, she talks about specific things. I've been reading some books lately, especially that are talking about this particular subject, and I think I'd like to recommend two books by two colleagues that I worked with last summer on the Network to Freedom Project. The first book is called Seed of Empire, and it's written by Andrew Torgetz. And the reason, I love that book. I felt that it was fantastically written, and it gave a wonderful perspective of what life was like in what we know today as Texas, when Texas was still part of Mexico. And it talks about Texas's attitude towards slavery, and how Stephen F. Austin, went to Mexico City and was arguing at length with the people who were running the government of Coahuila y Tejas, and in the main government of Mexico, and he just covers that whole topic extremely well. And so I think in order for somebody to wrap their arms around this particular topic, reading that book is a great place to start, because it places you into the mentality of a person from that time period. It paints a pretty clear picture of what life was like in what we know today as Texas, and how the institution of slavery really was prevalent, and how the folks from that particular part of time were skating around, the issue of, redefining their slaves as, indentured servants or contract laborers and things like that. So I recommend that book. Another book I've been reading is by Alice Baumgartner, called South to Freedom. And she gives, I think she, 8 years and 23 archives, and most of the archives being in Mexico. She did a tremendous amount of research about what was happening in Mexico during that period of time, and what pulled those freedom seekers south to Mexico. And she really gives a very clear picture of the process through the Mexican, the Spanish government into the Mexican government, of exactly when, how, and why freedom or slavery was abolished, and all of the different sidebar conversations about it. I even have a question after reading her book, that in 1827 in Mexico, Mexico was trying to state that children born to a slave were not slaves, because they did not want to have slavery. So my question about that is, well, the children born to Sylvia Hector and John Weber, they were born after 1827, because Elsie, I'm pretty sure, was born 1829, then Henry, then Leonard in 1832 and 1834. Well, they should not have been considered slaves. So there's a lot of things happening across the border with the Mexican, Mexican government, especially when they got their independence from Spain, New Spain, in 1821, that, just things were going back and forth, and it was, inspiring these self-emancipators to want to get closer, get across that, get into Mexico, so they could stand up and say, I am free.
Thank you. Thank you. We are almost 20 minutes over time. I just wanted to open it up to any final questions that our audience might have. please feel free to drop them in the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and jump in and ask the question. Also, I want to point your attention to the chat box. There's a whole list of books in there for those of you that are interested in additional material on this subject. So please take a look. Any final questions before we let Dr. Garza, Bacha-Garza go? All right, well, were Indians enslaved as well is a question in the chat box.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Any other questions? I know this is a subject that we could talk on and on and on about and learn a whole lot more about from you, but we hope to bring you back for sort of a follow-up conversation at some point. But thank you so much, Roseann, for your time, for sharing all your research and your information. I know you mentioned before everyone else came on the call, you mentioned that you are getting ready to start work on another book. So good luck with that. And we look forward to seeing more of your work, and hopefully to hear more from you in the future. So thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us. We will be sending a Facebook Live link to this presentation to you via email. Please feel free to share it. And
Great.
we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Okay.
Thank you.
Roseann,
Yes.
I do have one quick question, please, if you
Yes.
have a second.
I do.
You know, I just went and visited the Varner hog plantation over in West Columbus today, and they had a very similar story. I mean, I don't believe the Patton family who was there and had sugarcane and cotton that they were, farming on that land during their period of time, but their son, Columbus Patton, had taken Rachel, a slave of the family, as his, and I'm putting air quotes around it, wife. The community basically never really accepted her in that position. And so it's just kind of a similar story. Not that I did not get from the information I saw today that he fought for her freedom, but I believe they had 7 children between the two of them. And that when he died, he did leave land to his wife, Rachel, the children, and land to the slaves. So that just might be something, since you're researching all of this, I don't know if this plays any part in it.
Yeah.
That is an interesting story, Dina, and the sort of the latter part of that story also is that the family, the rest of the family, Patton family, fought that that bequest that Columbus Patton had left for
Yes.
For Rachel, and
she ended up having to leave because of the pressure. Yes.
Yeah, it's a very interesting
Thank you
story.
for sharing that. Yes, I did see that.
Yeah. And there's another book I'd like to recommend. I know, I'm sorry, I'm going over, but
No, that's fine.
Some of you are still here. But another book I would like to recommend to kind of paint the picture of, how absolutely horrible slavery was, and how horrible slavery was in Texas. There is a book titled Jean-Claude Rousseau's Escape from Texas. And it is a reproduction of some, not all, because he had to burn them out of fear for his life to be caught with them. But he was an immigrant from Belgium, an astronomer, and he had witnessed horrific things. And we have a lot of history of, let's say, German immigrants in Texas who were very sympathetic to freedom seekers. And I know Maria Hammock is really trying hard to find different conductors of what we would call a Harriet Tubman of Texas, people who were assisting freedom seekers.
Can you repeat that name, Dr. Bacha-Garza, again, please? The book title?
It's Jean-Claude Uso, which is spelled Houzou. I don't know. I used to have the book right here. I think it's at on my coffee table at home. And it's his escape from Texas. I'm sure if you Google it, it'll come up. And I had, because of one of these presentations, the woman who did the translation of his letters had contacted me and talked to me about, what she found out while translating these letters. And what he did was he did assist people to, in a small way, but he did assist freedom seekers. But as he was trying to make his way from the center of Texas down toward Brownsville and Matamoros, so he could hop on a steamer and get the heck out of town, he had written down in a diary or letters home what he witnessed. And he ended up burning them because he didn't want to be caught with them. And if he were to be caught with them and considered somebody who was assisting runaway slaves, then he would have faced some pretty dire consequences. So these are books that are, paint the picture for people as to what was happening in this region at that time. And it gives you an idea. And then, with Dr. Hammock's work and others, I know there's a professor in New Jersey, Michaela Aldane, is coming out with a book soon. I don't think it's out yet, but I believe it's coming out soon. And then Dr. Jane Landers, who I worked with last summer at the National Park Service, she's written about Black Seminoles and those folks over by Piedras Negras and Eagle Pass into Mexico, into Nacimientos de los Negros, in that area. She's definitely an expert in Spanish colonial times, into Black Seminoles as well. So there's so much. I just suggest just engrossing yourself in all these other books so you could get a clear picture of what life was like here at that time.
Great. Thank you so much. Again, thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to having you back. Dr. Bacha-Garza talked about undertold markers. That's our next presentation, next event in May. So please do join us for that, May 12th at 6 p.m. Until then, good night. Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you for coming. Great questions.
Thank you, everyone.
Mm-hmm.